You know the sound a dying world makes. It isn't a scream. It's a slow mechanical exhale. The hum of failing air scrubbers. The metallic groans of bulkheads buckling under pressure. We were 300 stranded souls on a rock at the edge of the galaxy, staring down an alien armada that measured its kills in billions. The math was absolute. We were dead. And then the sensors screamed. A single human warship dropped out of the dark. It didn't come to rescue us. It came to pick a fight. The air on Outpost Delta tasted like copper and unwashed bodies. Cole sat in the command chair, though. Command was a generous word for a metal stool bolted to a rattling floor plate. He stared at the primary tactical plot. The screen was cracked down the middle, a spiderweb of dead pixels that bisected the incoming nightmare. Red dots. Hundreds of them. They bled into the system like an infection creeping through a vein. "Time to optimal firing range," Cole asked. His voice didn't shake. He was too tired for fear. Fear required energy, and Cole had spent his last reserve of that commodity 3 weeks ago when the core fleet abandoned the sector. Hayes looked up from her console. She was 22 tops, with dark circles under her eyes, so deep they looked like bruises. She hadn't slept since Tuesday. 4 hours, sir. Maybe less if they catch the gravitational whip around the gas giant. They're not slowing down. Why would they? Donovan grunted from the corner. The security chief was currently using a greasy rag to wipe down an empty assault rifle. It was a pointless gesture. They had exhausted their kinetic rounds defending the lower mining tiers yesterday. Now the rifle was just a very expensive club. "They know we're out of teeth. The renders don't do sieges. They just do cleanup." Cole didn't correct him. The render's a colloquialism for a biomechanical species that communicated exclusively through the orbital bombardment of populated worlds were brutally efficient. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't negotiate. They just consumed, processed, and moved on. And Outpost Delta was next on the menu. "Scrubbers are at 19%. Miller's voice crackled over the intercom. The chief engineer sounded like he was speaking from inside a tin can. "I've patched the secondary bypass, Cole, but if they sneeze on our shields, the reactor is going to critical. I can't hold the containment field with spit and duct tape." "Understood, Miller. Just keep the lights on until they get here," Cole replied, keying the mic off. He leaned back the cheap metal of the chair, biting into his spine. This was the end of the line. The grand human expansion reduced to 300 starving miners' mechanics and disgraced military washouts waiting to be vaporized in the dark. Cole looked at the faces in the command center. Hayes desperately tapping at keys trying to find a mathematical miracle that didn't exist. Donovan polishing a useless gun out of sheer stubborn habit. Carter, the logistics officer, quietly weeping in the corner while holding a crumpled physical photograph of a family back on Earth. It was deeply, profoundly pathetic. "Sir," Hayes said, her voice dropping an octave, "I'm getting a weird telemetry reading from the outer buoys." "The render shifting formation?" Cole asked, not looking away from the cracked screen. "No, it's behind them. Deep space. Mass shadow approaching." Donovan stopped polishing his rifle. The heavy silence in the room suddenly felt suffocating. Another render fleet. They bringing the whole damn neighborhood. It doesn't match a render displacement signature. Hayes's fingers flew across her physical keyboard, the clacking echoing sharply in the quiet room. "The mass is too dense. It's singular. The renders travel in swarms. Their displacement is fractured. This is a solid block. A huge one. Cole stood up. His knees popped. Show me. The main tactical display shifted, panning away from the overwhelming wave of red dots to the dark, empty space beyond the system's edge. At first there was nothing, just the static of cosmic background radiation. Then a spike. The graphing metrics on the left side of the screen spiked so violently they clipped the top of the monitor. Gravitational anomaly. Hayes whispered, her face bathed in the harsh blue light of the console. Something is ripping a hole in real space. Jesus, the energy output. It's tearing the local vacuum apart. Natural phenomenon, Cole asked. With an engineered containment field, Hayes countered, shaking her head. No, that's a slip-space rupture. Someone is jumping in. Donovan scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. Core fleet, did the admirals finally find their spines? No way, Cole murmured, stepping closer to the glass. Core fleet vessels don't have the mass to generate a rupture that size unless they're jumping a whole carrier strike group simultaneously, and they wouldn't do that for a dirt rock mining colony. The rupture is stabilizing, Hayes said, her breath catching. Coming out of transit, now. The screen whited out for a fraction of a second, the sensor struggling to process the sudden injection of exotic radiation into the local grid. When the glare faded, a new icon appeared on the tactical plot. It wasn't red, it was green. A collective gasp sucked the remaining stale oxygen from the room. Cole's hands gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles turning white. IFF tag, he demanded. Hayes was shaking. She hit a key and the computer parsed the incoming data string. It's an old code, sir. Pre-expansion. Audio-only unencrypted broadcast. Put it on the speakers. A burst of heavy static filled the command center, followed by a low mechanical hum. Then a voice. It wasn't the polished, synthesized cadence of a core fleet AI. It was a human voice, rough, gravelly, and laced with decades of inhaled starship exhaust. Outpost Delta, this is the UNS Goliath. We read your distress beacon. Keep your heads down. We're coming in hot. The transmission cut. Cole stared at the screen. The UNS Goliath. It was a ghost story. A dreadnought from the First Contact Wars, supposedly decommissioned and scuttled half a century ago. It was a relic, a brutalist monument to a time when humanity didn't build ships to explore, they built them to survive. One ship. Donovan said, the fleeting spark of hope in his eyes dying instantly. It's one 50-year-old ship against 300 render cruisers. He threw his rag onto the deck. They didn't come to save us. They came to die with us. Cole didn't answer. He just watched the solitary green dot on the screen, a lone spark against a tidal wave of red. The optical feeds finally cleared, shedding the residual radiation of the slip-space jump. Put her on the main viewer, Cole ordered. The cracked screen flickered, shifting from tactical wireframes to a direct visual feed. When the image resolved, nobody spoke. The UNS Goliath did not look like a savior. It looked like a floating iron lung. There were no sleek aerodynamic curves, no gleaming white armor plates like the modern core fleet vessels. The Goliath was a jagged, asymmetrical slab of raw tungsten and depleted uranium. It was heavily scarred, its hull pockmarked with craters from plasma burns and kinetic impacts that looked decades old. Entire sections of its outer plating had been stripped away and replaced with scavenged armor from other vessels. Some of it didn't even look human. It looked heavy. It looked ugly. It looked incredibly mean. Look at the engine block. Miller's voice came over the comms, a touch of reverent awe bleeding through his cynical exterior. They've ripped out the safety limiters. The exhaust venting is a mess. If they push that drive core past 70%, they'll melt their own struts. They aren't planning on running, Cole said softly. Sir, the render fleet is reacting, Hayes reported. They've halted their advance on Delta. They're reorienting. 80 vessels breaking off the main swarm moving to intercept the Goliath. On the screen, the wave of red dots fractured. The renders were hive-minded, calculating, and totally devoid of emotion. They recognized a new threat variable and immediately allocated the necessary resources to crush it. 80 cruisers each, armed with enough plasma artillery to glass a continent, turned their sleek, bioluminescent holes toward the lone human ship. They're hailing us again, Hayes said. Put it through. Delta. This is Goliath Actual. Name's Bishop. The gravelly voice returned. In the background, Cole could hear the distinct, terrifying screech of metal under immense stress. We're picking up severe structural degradation on your end. What's your shield status? Cole leaned over the mic. Bishop, this is Commander Cole. Our shields are paper. One glancing blow and our reactor goes. But listen to me, you need to jump back out. You're looking at a 300-ship armada. You can't take them. Turn around. A low chuckle echoed through the comms. It was a cold, humorless sound. Cole, this rust bucket lost its reverse thrusters in the Orion campaign 20 years ago. We only have one gear. You're committing suicide, Cole said, his voice flat. We're buying you time. Shut down your non-essential grids, divert everything to structural integrity, and enjoy the show. Goliath out. The channel went dead. Cole looked at the visual feed. The Goliath was moving. It wasn't dancing gracefully through the void. It was lumbering forward, bleeding momentum like a gutted pig, its massive sublight thrusters, burning a dirty, furious orange against the blackness of space. They're not raising shields. Hayes noted, her brow furrowed in confusion. Sir, I'm reading their power distribution. They have a deflector array, but it's completely unpowered. Are they insane? Donovan stepped up to the console. The renders are going to carve them into pieces before they even get into kinetic range. Look at the power grid. Cole pointed to the telemetry data scrolling down the side of the screen. They aren't powering shields because they're dumping the entire output of their reactor into the spinal mount. Hayes's eyes widened. The Mac gun, the magnetic accelerator cannon. It was an antiquated weapon deemed too slow and too energy inefficient for modern warfare. Why use a massive railgun when you could use pinpoint laser arrays? But the Goliath was built in an era before pinpoint accuracy. It was built around a gun the size of a skyscraper. Render Vanguard is entering maximum firing range, Hayes whispered. On the screen, the darkness of space was suddenly illuminated by dozens of brilliant, blinding flashes. The render cruisers opened fire. Volleys of superheated plasma streaked across the void, a rain of blue-white death hurtling toward the sluggish human dreadnought. Impact in 3, 2, 1. The plasma struck the Goliath. The visual feed flared wildly as the raw energy splashed against the ship's physical armor. Chunks of tungsten shattered, glowing red-hot as they tumbled away into the vacuum. The sheer kinetic force of the plasma strikes pushed the massive dreadnought off its axis, its bow dipping downward. Hull breaches reported on their port side, Hayes read from the telemetry. Atmosphere venting, Decks 4 through 9 are exposed to the vacuum. They're dead, Donovan muttered. But the Goliath didn't explode. It didn't break apart. Through the boiling clouds of vented atmosphere and molten armor plating, the massive thrusters flared again, realigning the ship. It had taken a volley that would have vaporized a modern core fleet destroyer, and it just absorbed it. The raw thickness of its brutalist hull simply ate the heat. And then the Goliath fired back. There was no flash of light, no brilliant beam of energy, just a catastrophic violent vibration that Cole felt through the deck plates of Outpost Delta thousands of miles away. "Spinal mount discharged," Hayes gasped, clutching her headset. "Solid tungsten slug, 6,000 tons." Cole didn't need the sensors to tell him what happened next. The visual feed captured it in brutal, horrific detail. The Render Vanguard had tightened their formation, confident in their imminent victory. The Mac round crossed the distance between the two fleets in a fraction of a second. It didn't strike the Liad Render cruiser. It obliterated it. The kinetic energy was so absolute that the biomechanical alien ship simply ceased to exist, atomized into a cloud of expanding dust. But a 6,000-ton slug moving at a fraction of light speed doesn't just stop. The round tore through the first ship, struck the second behind it, shattered its central drive core, and kept going. It ripped through the formation like a bullet through wet paper, taking out 4 Render cruisers in a single devastating line before exiting the far side of the swarm and disappearing into deep space. Silence descended on the Outpost Delta Command Center. Donovan's jaw hung slightly open. Carter stopped crying. 4 ships, Donovan whispered. 1 shot. The Render fleet paused. It was a microsecond of hesitation, but to Cole, who had spent months watching these machines slaughter with algorithmic perfection, it was glaring. The hive mind was recalibrating. They had never encountered an enemy that weaponized pure, unadulterated mass with such disregard for efficiency. The Renders broke formation, scattering like roaches under a light. They realized line of sight against that gun was a death sentence. They began to swarm, accelerating to flank the lumbering human dreadnought. "They're moving in close," Hayes warned, "trying to get under the Goliath's main gun. Goliath, actual to Delta." Bishop's voice cracked over the comms again. He sounded winded, the background noise on his end, now a chaotic symphony of alarm, klaxons, and rushing air. "Hope you enjoyed the fireworks. We're going in." "Bishop, your armor is compromised. You can't take them in a dogfight," Cole yelled into the mic. "Who said anything about a dogfight? On the tactical plot, the Goliath didn't try to track the fast-moving Render ships with its primary weapon. Instead, its drive core flared with a terrifying suicidal intensity. "Miller," Cole shouted. "What are they doing?" My God, they're deliberately redlining the reactor," Miller yelled over the comms. "They're using the heat bleed-off to supercharge their point defense network." The Goliath drove itself directly into the center of the Render swarm. As the alien ships closed in, raking the dreadnought's hull with relentless plasma fire, the human ship awoke. Hundreds of concealed hatches along the Goliath's jagged hull blew open. Thousands of rapid-fire rotary cannons, flak batteries, and short-range missile pods deployed. It wasn't a targeted attack. It was a hemisphere of lead fire and shrapnel. The Goliath turned itself into a colossal fragmentation grenade. Space around the dreadnought became a meat grinder. The renders relying on energy shields to deflect lasers and plasma were caught completely off guard by the sheer volume of solid matter being hurled at them. Flak shells detonated in the vacuum, filling the void with clouds of jagged steel. Render ships slammed into the shrapnel clouds at combat speeds, their shields overloading and shattering under the relentless kinetic impact. The Goliath waded through the devastation, an angry, bleeding brawler. Cole watched mesmerized by the sheer violence of it. The human ship was taking horrific damage. The visual feed showed entire gun batteries being melted off the hull by retaliatory plasma fire. Pieces of the dreadnought were tearing away, spiraling off into the dark. Their bleeding atmosphere from 20 different decks. Hayes cried out, her fingers flying over the console. Life signs on the Goliath are dropping. They're dying in there. They know, Cole said softly. He understood now. This wasn't a rescue mission. This was a statement. The universe had decided that humanity was finished, that their time had passed, that they were nothing more than a statistical anomaly waiting to be erased. Bishop and his crew had brought the Goliath out of the grave to deliver a counter-argument. A render-heavy cruiser, massive and sleek, managed to push through the flak screen. It aligned itself directly above the Goliath, its ventral plasma batteries glowing with lethal intent. It was too close for the dreadnought to use its main gun, and the point defense cannons were bouncing off the cruiser's heavy armor. "They're right on top of them," Donovan said, gripping the console. On the visual feed, the Goliath did the unthinkable. It pitched upward, its massive thrusters burning with such force that the ship's own internal struts began to snap. Cole could see the sparks and explosive decompression rippling along its spine. It didn't fire a weapon. It used its own momentum. The Goliath rammed the render cruiser. The impact was cataclysmic. 6 million tons of human steel slammed into the delicate biomechanical belly of the alien warship. The render vessel buckled its hull, shrieking as the jagged, heavily armored prow of the Goliath buried itself deep into the enemy's chassis. The two ships tangled together, locked in a deadly embrace, spiraling through the void. "My God," Hayes breathed. "Bishop?" Cole said into the comms, his voice tight. "Bishop, pull out of there. Your reactor is going to breach," Static hissed back. Then Bishop's voice, accompanied by the horrific sound of tearing metal and the blare of a ship-wide evacuation alarm. "Negative Delta. We've got them right where we want them. Hold the line. The rest of the fleet is right behind us." Cole froze. "What, did you really think we came alone?" Before Cole could process the words, Hayes screamed, not in terror, but in absolute shock. "Sir, the sensor boys, the deep space anomaly, it wasn't just one rupture. The tactical plot on the cracked screen suddenly refreshed. The green dot of the Goliath was no longer alone. Behind it, in the deep dark of space, the vacuum began to tear again. Not once, not twice. 30 new slipspace ruptures opened simultaneously. Cole stared at the screen as the ghosts of humanity's past stepped out of the dark, battered, bruised, and heavily armed. The 30 slipspace ruptures didn't open with the synchronized, mathematically perfect precision of a core fleet deployment. They tore into real space like jagged wounds, staggered, and violent spitting exotic radiation across the tactical plot. Hayes was gripping the edge of her console so hard her fingers were bone white. The cracked screen of Outpost Delta's command center struggled to render the chaotic influx of telemetry data. "Identify them," Cole ordered. His voice was a rasp. He couldn't blink. He was terrified that if he closed his eyes, the green dots would vanish, exposed as a cruel glitch of failing sensors. Processing IFF tags. Hayes breathed, her hands flying. Sir, these aren't military registries, or at least not current ones. The visual feed adjusted to the glare of the arriving fleet. Cole felt a heavy, suffocating knot form in his stomach. It wasn't a fleet. It was a junkyard. Leading the charge was a massive, blocky vessel that looked like a floating brick. It lacked any aerodynamic symmetry. Its sides were plastered with faded, peeling yellow hazard stripes. The Birmingham Hayes read the data string, her voice trembling. It's a deep space ore refinery, decommissioned 12 years ago. Beside the Birmingham drifted a cluster of smaller, mismatched hulls. There were retrofitted ice haulers with makeshift armor plates bolted over their atmospheric entry shields. There were civilian freighters bristling with ugly aftermarket point defense turrets welded directly onto their cargo bays. There were 2 first contact-era destroyers, their primary drive rings exposed and leaking dirty plasma. They brought garbage scows to a war zone, Donovan whispered. The security chief had stopped pretending to be a hardened cynic. He just looked lost. Open a channel, Cole said. Broad spectrum, static hissed out of the overhead speakers, instantly overwhelmed by a cacophony of overlapping voices. There was no polished military discipline here. It was the sound of panicked mechanics, swearing pilots, and overloaded engine alarms. Portside thrusters are redlining. Give me more juice to the deflectors. Lock on to the Goliath's beacon. Don't break formation, or they'll carve you up. Someone tell Gallagher to stop crowding my stern. I'm hauling 6,000 tons of volatile chemical propellant. If they hit me, I'm taking him with me. Cole slammed his palm onto the comms desk. Unidentified vessels, this is Outpost Delta Actual. You are flying into a slaughter. You have no military shielding. The renders will cut through you in seconds. The chaotic chatter dipped for a moment. Then a new voice broke through the static. It belonged to an older woman. She sounded like she had spent a lifetime inhaling unfiltered engine grease. Delta, this is Captain Cobb of the heavy hauler Shenandoah. We hear you loud and clear, but we didn't burn a hole through hyperspace to turn around. Cobb, you are civilians, Cole pleaded. Look at the tactical plot. They have 200 cruisers left. They outgun you 50-1. They outgunned Bishop too, Cobb replied calmly. And he just shoved a dreadnought down their throats. We aren't here to win a dogfight, Delta. We're here to build a wall. All ships execute the graveyard shift. Lock trajectories and link localized deflector grids. On the cracked screen, the ragtag fleet accelerated. They didn't spread out to engage the nimble render cruisers. They tightened their formation into a dense overlapping cluster, forming a physical barrier between the alien swarm and Outpost Delta. The renders reacted instantly. The hive mind processed the new targets, recognized their structural inferiority, and unleashed hell. Volleys of blue-white plasma streaked across the void, illuminating the dark side of the gas giant in an eerie, flickering strobe light. The plasma hammered into the makeshift fleet. The Shenandoah took a direct hit to its forward cargo bay. The unarmored section of the ship instantly vaporized, leaving a glowing molten crater the size of a city block. But the ship didn't stop. It kept burning its sublight engines, holding its place in the wall. They're linking their civilian navigation deflectors, Miller realized over the intercom, his voice thick with disbelief. It's a localized feedback loop. They're sharing the kinetic dispersion across all 30 hulls. If you hit one, the kinetic shock bleeds into the others. "It's not enough to stop plasma," Hayes cried out. "The Birmingham is taking critical damage to its lower decks. They're burning from the inside out." It was a massacre. The renders were methodical carving chunks of metal off the human ships with surgical precision. But the humans weren't fighting back with lasers or smart missiles. They were fighting back with industrial equipment. The Birmingham, its lower decks glowing cherry red from thermal damage, triggered its massive ore processing lasers. These weren't designed for pinpoint targeting. They were designed to crack open small moons. A thick, continuous beam of raw thermal energy lashed out, sweeping clumsily across the render formation. It lacked range, but when it dragged across a render cruiser, the alien vessel simply popped its biomechanical hull, unable to dissipate the sustained brute force heat. "Good God," Donovan breathed. "They're using mining lasers." "Delta, the wall is holding," Cobb coughed over the radio. In the background, Cole could hear the terrifying screech of structural bulkheads failing. "Keep your heads down. We're going to make these bastards bleed for every inch of vacuum." The battle devolved from a tactical engagement into a back-alley brawl. The tactical plot was a mess of debris fields, expanding gas clouds, and the dying signatures of human and render vessels alike. At the center of the carnage, the UNS Goliath remained locked in its death grip with the render-heavy cruiser. "Telemetry on the Goliath is failing." Hayes reported, her eyes darting across scrolling lines of code. "Their main reactor is fluctuating wildly. Bishop is bleeding power." "Can you get him on comms?" Cole asked, pacing the narrow space behind her chair. "Interference is too heavy. The radiation from the plasma strikes is scrambling local bands." "But sir," Hayes hesitated, "I'm reading secondary explosions inside the Goliath's hull, not from plasma strikes, from the inside." Donovan gripped his useless rifle. "Boarding parties. The renders don't just shoot. When they get close enough, they breach and clear. They're inside the dreadnought." Cole stared at the visual feed. The Goliath was a jagged silhouette against the flashbulb explosions of the surrounding battle. It was venting atmosphere from a dozen different wounds, spinning slowly, uncontrollably in tandem with the alien cruiser it had rammed. Somewhere in the dark, freezing corridors of that ancient warship, Bishop and his crew were fighting hand-to-hand against a biomechanical nightmare. They were fighting with shotguns, welding torches, and whatever heavy blunt instruments they could pry off the walls. They were dying in the dark, so Outpost Delta could breathe for another hour. "New contacts!" Hayes yelled, snapping Cole back to the immediate threat. "A detachment of render cruisers is breaking off from the main swarm. 12 ships. They're swinging wide, going around the graveyard wall." "Target?" Cole asked, though he already knew the answer. "Us. They've realized the fleet is just a shield. They're coming to cut off the head." The 12 sleek bioluminescent alien ships banked hard, accelerating away from the chaotic melee of the main battle line. They aligned their prows directly toward the small, insignificant rock that housed Outpost Delta. "Time to firing range," Cole asked. 3 minutes. Cole keyed the internal intercom. "Miller, divert everything to the structural integrity fields. I mean everything. Cut life support, cut gravity, cut the lights. Give me every joule of power you have." "You got it, Cole. See you on the other side." The intercom clicked off. The command center plunged into darkness. The only illumination came from the harsh, flickering blue light of Hayes's tactical console and the cracked main viewer. The artificial gravity cut out seconds later. Cole grabbed the back of Hayes's chair to anchor himself, feeling his stomach float into his chest. 2 minutes, Hayes whispered. Outpost Delta was entirely defenseless. It was a mining rig bolted to an asteroid. It had no point defense cannons, no evasive thrusters. It was a stationary target. "They're powering ventral batteries," Donovan said, staring at the screen. "It was a good run, Cole." 1 minute. On the tactical plot, a single green dot broke formation from the human wall. It was the Shenandoah. The heavy hauler was already catastrophically damaged. Its forward cargo bay was gone, and its port engine nacelle was trailing a massive cloud of burning chemical fuel. But it was moving fast, burning its remaining thrusters beyond all safety tolerances. "Delta, this is Cobb," the comms crackled. The older woman's voice was barely a whisper, now strained and heavily wheezing. "Looks like you've got a leak in your roof. I'm coming to patch it." "Cobb negative," Cole shouted, pulling himself toward the comms panel. "You're venting fuel. If you intercept them, you're going to catch the crossfire. You won't survive the impact." "Cole, my reactor casing cracked 10 minutes ago. I'm breathing hard radiation right now. We were dead before we even jumped in." A wet, heavy cough rattled the speakers. "Tell the core fleet admirals. Tell them the dirt kickers held the line. The Shenandoah didn't fire any weapons. It didn't try to evade. It simply threw its massive burning bulk directly into the path of the 12 incoming render cruisers. The alien ships fired simultaneously. 12 beams of concentrated plasma struck the heavy hauler. The Shenandoah didn't just explode, it shattered. The unstable chemical propellant in its remaining cargo holds ignited, creating a thermonuclear fireball that momentarily turned the vacuum of space into daylight. The shockwave hit Outpost Delta a few seconds later. The entire facility groaned, the metal bulkhead shrieking in protest as the kinetic force of the expanding gas cloud slammed into the asteroid. Cole lost his grip on the chair and slammed hard into the deck plates, tasting blood as his lips split. "Status," Cole yelled, pushing himself up in the zero-gravity environment, floating awkwardly above the floor. Hayes was strapped into her seat, frantically clearing error messages from her console. The shockwave, it disrupted their formation. The expanding debris field from the Shenandoah shredded the shields on 4 of the render cruisers. The remaining 8 have aborted their attack run. They're pulling back to the main swarm to avoid the shrapnel. Cole floated to the screen. The green icon for the Shenandoah was gone, wiped from the board. He looked at the tactical plot. The human wall was crumbling. The Birmingham was dead in the water, a burning hulk. 3 smaller freighters had been reduced to floating slag. The fleet of ghosts was bleeding iron into the void, dying inch by inch to buy Delta time. And Delta was just sitting there, watching them die. "No," Cole said. The word was quiet, but it hung heavily in the dark, silent command center. Sir Hayes looked up. "We are not going to sit here and watch them bleed out." Cole grabbed the edge of the console, pulling himself down to the deck, his boots finding purchase on a magnetic strip. He keyed the intercom. "Miller, do we still have control of the tether network?" "Barely." Miller's voice came back tight with stress. "The primary cables are intact, but without power. The mass drivers are offline." Outpost Delta mined dense heavy metals from the planetoid below, launching the raw ore into orbit using massive electromagnetic rail tethers. "If I give you power back, can you angle the mass drivers away from the orbital collection bins? Can you aim them into deep space?" There was a long pause. When Miller spoke again, the cynical engineer sounded dangerously awake. You want to fire raw iron ore at the render fleet. 6-ton blocks of it, Cole confirmed. Can you do it? I have to override the safety interlocks. The recoil alone might rip the tethers right out of the asteroid crust. It could crack the outpost in half. We're dead anyway, Miller. Do it. The floor of Outpost Delta vibrated with a low, terrifying hum as power was violently rerouted from the structural integrity fields down into the industrial depths of the mining colony. Tether 1 is coming online. Hayes reported, her hands moving with a renewed, frantic energy. Aiming telemetry is completely manual, sir. We have no targeting computers for the mass drivers. It's dumb fire only. I don't need a computer. Cole said, his eyes locked on the chaotic swarm of red dots clogging the tactical plot. The renders were clustered tightly around the surviving human ships, trying to overwhelm their linked deflector grids through sheer volume of fire. The swarm is dense enough, just pointed at the biggest concentration of red, aligning Tether 1. Hayes manipulated the physical controls, manually adjusting the pitch and yaw of a mechanism the size of a skyscraper buried deep in the rock below them. Loaded. We have a 6-ton block of raw, unprocessed iron sitting in the chamber. Fire. Deep beneath the command center, magnetic coils that hadn't been fully serviced in a decade shrieked as they were hit with a massive surge of power. The electromagnetic pulse was so strong, it wiped out the auxiliary lighting in the hallway outside. A deafening metallic crack echoed through the bones of the outpost. The recoil was catastrophic. Cole felt the entire facility lurch sideways, the bolts securing the command console to the floor, shearing off with a sound like gunshots. "Driver fired!" Hayes yelled over the noise of failing metal. On the visual feed, there was no glowing tracer. There was no bright flash of plasma. There was only a 6-ton chunk of jagged iron accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light, hurtling silently through the void. It crossed the distance between the outpost and the battle in a heartbeat. It slammed blindly into the dense formation of the render swarm. It didn't just penetrate the kinetic shields of a biomechanical cruiser. It turned the vessel inside out. The sheer kinetic force of the raw ore struck with the power of a tactical nuke, fracturing the alien ship into 1,000,000 pieces of glowing shrapnel that instantly shredded the 2 cruisers flying alongside it. "Direct hit," Donovan roared, slamming his fist against the bulkhead. 3 hostile signatures erased. Load Tether 2. Cole ordered, not allowing himself to celebrate. The math was still against them. "Tether 2 loaded," Miller called out over the comms. "But Cole, the seismic feedback is tearing the foundation apart. We fire this one, we might lose the lower atmospheric scrubbers." Fire. Another deafening crack. Another violent lurch that threw Cole against the wall. On the screen, a second block of iron hammered into the alien fleet. This one missed a direct hit, but clipped the engine block of a massive render command ship. The kinetic shockwaves snapped the vessel's spine, sending it spiraling uncontrollably into its own escort fighters. The render hive mind, already struggling to adapt to the unpredictable, brutalist tactics of the human scrap fleet, was suddenly faced with a new, terrifying variable. The helpless rock they had come to glass was shooting back, and it was using the planet itself as ammunition. "They're breaking off!" Hayes shouted, pointing at the tactical plot. The swarm of red dots was fracturing. The relentless pressure on the human wall eased as dozens of render cruisers aborted their attack. Runs their algorithms, forcing them to scatter to avoid the devastating invisible kinetic artillery raining down from Outpost Delta. Delta, "This is Gallagher on the stone wall." A new voice crackled over the comms. "We see your impacts. Keep throwing rocks. You're giving us room to breathe. Load tether 3. Cole said, his vision swimming slightly from the impact against the wall. "Loading," Hayes said, her voice strained. "Sir, the targeting module on tether 3 is jammed. The recoil warped the track." "Can you fire it blind?" "Yes, but I can't guarantee it won't hit our own ships." Cole hesitated. A blind shot into that chaotic mess of metal and plasma was a coin toss. He looked at the screen. The Birmingham was barely holding together, acting as an anvil, while the remaining human ships used its massive hull for cover. "Hold your fire," Cole said, wiping blood from his chin. "Don't risk hitting our people." Suddenly, the proximity alarms in the command center began to scream. It wasn't the high-pitched warning of an incoming plasma strike. It was a deep guttural klaxon indicating a massive displacement of local gravity. "Hayes," Cole demanded. "It's not a tether launch," Hayes stammered, staring at her console in disbelief. "And it's not a slip-space rupture. It's the Goliath." Cole looked at the main viewer. The UNS Goliath, still locked in its brutal embrace with the render-heavy cruiser, was moving. The dreadnought's massive sublight engines, which had been dark for the last 20 minutes, suddenly flared to life. They didn't burn a steady orange. They burned a violent, blinding white. "Bishop's overriding his own engine safeties," Miller yelled over the open channel. "He's dumping the core." The Goliath used its sudden catastrophic surge of thrust not to break free from the alien cruiser, but to drive it forward. The dying human dreadnought pushed the alien command ship like a bulldozer, accelerating directly toward the densest cluster of the retreating render swarm. "Outpost Delta, Fleet Actual," Bishop's voice came over the comms one last time. There was no background noise anymore. No alarms, no gunfire, just the calm, terrifying silence of a man who had accepted his math. "Wall's built, close the door." "Bishop, don't do it," Cole yelled into the mic. The Goliath reached the center of the render formation. Then the 50-year-old fusion reactor, at the heart of the dreadnought, deliberately pushed light years past its critical threshold, detonated. There was no sound. The visual feed instantly whited out the optical sensors, burning out from the sheer intensity of the flash. On the tactical plot, a sphere of pure, unadulterated energy expanded at a terrifying speed. It swallowed the render-heavy cruiser instantly. It swallowed the Goliath. It washed over 40 surrounding render vessels, their shields vaporizing before their hulls turned to ash. The shock wave of exotic radiation hit the human fleet, violently shoving the surviving scrap ships backward, their deflectors flashing blindingly as they absorbed the residual kinetic force. When the glare finally faded from the cracked screen, the command center was dead silent. Cole stared at the tactical plot. The center of the render fleet was gone. A massive empty hole existed where 40 ships had been seconds before. The Goliath was gone. The remaining render cruisers, their numbers severely depleted and their hive mind coordination shattered by the sudden loss of their heavy command ships, did something humanity had never seen them do in 3 years of relentless warfare. The red dots turned around. They accelerated away from Outpost Delta, engaging their slipspace drives. They ran. Cole stood in the dark, floating slightly in the zero gravity, staring at the empty space on the screen where a single green dot had once been. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. They had held the line, and the void was full of ghosts. The silence that follows a battle isn't peaceful. It is the heaviest, most oppressive sound in the universe. Inside the command center of Outpost Delta, there was no cheering. There was no triumphant swell of emotion. There was only the ragged collective breathing of people who had fully prepared to die and now didn't know what to do with the fact that they were still breathing. Cole hung suspended in the zero gravity of the dark room, his boots unlatched from the magnetic deck plates. The emergency auxiliary lighting finally kicked in, a sickly strobing amber that cast long distorted shadows across the battered bulkheads. "Hayes," Cole croaked. His throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass. "Give me a damage report." Hayes didn't answer immediately. She was still strapped into her chair, her hands hovering above her dead console, shaking uncontrollably. She was staring at the cracked main viewer. The space above the outpost was a graveyard. Thousands of twisted fragments of metal drifted through the void. Splintered biomechanical plating from the render cruisers mingled with the scorched heavy tungsten of the human fleet. Frozen clouds of vented atmosphere hung in the dark, like ghosts glittering dimly against the light of the distant gas giant. "Hayes," Cole repeated softer this time. He reached out, grabbed the back of her chair, and pulled himself down, snapping his boots to the floor. He put a heavy hand on her shoulder. She blinked violently and swallowed hard. I'm sorry, sir. Rebooting auxiliary telemetry." She punched a manual override sequence into her board. The screen flickered, struggling to interpret the catastrophic mess of data floating outside. Delta's lower levels are exposed to the vacuum. Hayes reported, her voice thin but steadying. Tethers 2 and 3 ripped their anchor housings out of the bedrock. Sections of the lower mining tier are just gone. Miller sealed the bulkheads, but we lost atmospheric pressure in sectors 4 through 9. Casualties on the outpost. I'm reading life signs clustered in the central mess hall. Miller got most of the crew behind the primary blast doors before the recoil hit. But we lost the tether crews, 42 souls. Cole felt the number settle onto his chest like an anvil. 42 men and women who had manually loaded raw iron into a suicide cannon, knowing the structural feedback would likely kill them. They hadn't run. "And the fleet?" Cole asked, looking back at the screen. The tactical plot was no longer a neat arrangement of red and green dots. It was a smear of gray debris signatures. "Broadcasting on open channels now," Hayes said. The static that filled the room was different this time. Before the battle, it had been chaotic, full of angry, defiant shouts. Now it was a chorus of the dying. Automated distress beacons chimed a haunting rhythmic melody. The hiss of depressurizing cabins. The faint echoing voices of crewmen calling for medics that no longer existed. "Delta, this is Gallagher." A voice cut through the static. It was thick with exhaustion and pain. "Stonewall Actual." "Gallagher, this is Cole. What's your status?" "We're dead in the water." "Cole, reactor is offline. Life support is running on emergency batteries, maybe 30 minutes of air left. The Birmingham is gone. The Shenandoah is dust. I'm looking at, hell, I don't know, maybe 6 ships still in one piece. And I use that term loosely." Donovan stepped forward. The useless rifle finally dropped to the floor. "We have to get out there. We have EVA suits in the upper airlocks. We can string physical tow lines to the survivors, pull them into our atmosphere." "With what?" Cole asked bluntly. "Our tethers are shattered. We have no external thrusters. We're a rock. We have hands." Donovan snapped the cynical veneer entirely stripped away, revealing raw, desperate humanity. I am not letting them suffocate in the dark after they just parked their ships in front of plasma fire for us. Cole looked at Donovan, then at Hayes. He nodded. Hayes, coordinate with Miller. Tell him to prep the central airlock. Bleed the remaining oxygen from the upper decks into the quarantine bay. We're going to pack it with as many survivors as we can fit. Cole turned to the security chief. Donovan, grab every able-bodied person on this rock who can fit into an EVA suit. Take the magnetic grapple guns. If you can hook a drifting hull, we'll manually winch them in. On it, Donovan grabbed the bulkhead frame and shoved himself down the dark corridor, moving with desperate purpose. Cole keyed the mic. Gallagher, listen to me. Conserve your air. We are coming out to get you. Do you have external lighting? Negative. Main grid is fried. Then hit the hull with something heavy, Cole ordered. We'll find you by the noise. For the next 4 hours, the space around Outpost Delta became a desperate, agonizing salvage operation. The void was pitch black, illuminated only by the sweeping beams of helmet-mounted flashlights. Cole found himself on the exterior of the asteroid, breathing the stale canned air of a battered EVA suit. The silence of space was broken only by his own heavy breathing and the radio chatter of Donovan's extraction teams. They moved like spiders across the jagged surface of the asteroid, firing magnetic harpoons into the drifting, crippled husks of the civilian fleet. When a harpoon latched onto a ship, a dozen exhausted miners would physically haul on the heavy steel cables, dragging the multi-ton wrecks closer to the outpost's airlocks. It was primitive. It was brutal. It was exhausting. Cole hooked his boots to the edge of a massive sheared-off hull plate belonging to an ice hauler. Inside the dark, freezing compartment, 3 crew members were huddled together in emergency thermal blankets. Their breath was crystallizing in the air. Got you, Cole grunted over the short-range radio, forcing the manual release valve on the ship's warped airlock. The metal groaned in protest before snapping open. He reached a gloved hand inside. Come on, we're going home. They pulled 300 people from the wreckage. 300 starving, freezing, bleeding civilians who had flown mining rigs and garbage scows into the teeth of an alien apocalypse. They couldn't save everyone. Cole floated past the shattered remains of a retrofitted freighter. Through the cracked crystalline viewport of the bridge, he could see the crew. They were frozen in their seats, their faces perfectly preserved by the vacuum, staring out into the dark. He paused, placing a hand against the cold glass. He didn't know their names. He didn't know where they came from. But he knew exactly what they had bought with their lives. Sir Hayes's voice crackled in his earpiece, pulling him away from the glass. She sounded strange. Not panicked, but incredibly tense. You need to get back inside, right now. We're not done, Hayes. There's a piece of the Birmingham drifting on the port side. I'm seeing heat signatures. Cole, leave it to Donovan's team, Hayes interrupted. The outer perimeter sensors just lit up. Displacement anomalies. A lot of them. Cole froze. His blood ran cold. The renders. The hive mind had recalibrated. They had realized the Goliath's detonation was a desperate suicide tactic, not a repeatable weapon. They were coming back to finish the job. Tell Miller to kill the thermal exhaust, Cole barked, shoving off the frozen ship and using his suit's microthrusters to burn back toward the outpost. Play dead. Maybe they'll think we're just debris. Sir, Hayes hesitated. It's not the renders. Cole cycled through the primary airlock, tearing his helmet off before the pressurization cycle had even fully completed. He tasted the heavy metallic tang of the outpost's recycled air and sprinted down the corridor toward the command center. When he burst through the doors, the main viewer was alive with new data. The slip-space ruptures were perfect. There was no violent tearing of the vacuum, no staggered, chaotic arrivals. The anomalies opened in a mathematically flawless grid, a terrifying display of controlled synchronized power. From the shimmering blue tiers, in reality, emerged the core fleet. They were beautiful, sleek aerodynamic destroyers with gleaming white armor that caught the distant starlight. Massive carriers with smooth sweeping curves, their launch bays already cycling with squadrons of perfectly maintained interceptors. They didn't look like they had ever seen a day of combat. They looked like propaganda posters come to life. There were 40 of them. A fully equipped, heavily armed strike group. IFF tags confirmed. Hayes said, her voice completely devoid of relief. She sounded disgusted. It's the 7th Fleet, Task Force Vanguard. Cole wiped sweat and grease from his forehead, leaving a dark smear across his pale skin. He stared at the gleaming ships holding a pristine formation just beyond the jagged debris field of the civilian fleet. "Where the hell were they?" Donovan muttered, stepping into the command center. The security chief was covered in dried blood from the salvage operation. He looked at the perfect white ships on the screen, and his jaw tightened. "Where were they 3 hours ago?" A sharp, clear chime echoed through the room. It wasn't the heavy static of a desperate civilian hail. It was a high-fidelity, encrypted military channel. "They're hailing us," Hayes said. "Put them through," Cole replied, leaning heavily against his console. The cracked screen split, shifting the tactical plot to the side to make room for a visual feed. The man on the screen was immaculate. His dark blue uniform was perfectly pressed, not a single crease out of place. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and the gold stars on his collar caught the bright, sterile lighting of his bridge. He looked at the camera with an expression of polite, detached professional concern. "Outpost Delta. This is Admiral West commanding the Core Fleet Task Force Vanguard," the man said. His voice was smooth, carrying the authoritative cadence of someone who was used to giving orders from behind a desk, light years away from the bleeding edge. "We received anomalous telemetry from this sector. We expected to find this installation neutralized. Report your status." Cole stared at the pristine admiral. He thought about the frozen faces in the ice hauler. He thought about Bishop incinerating himself in the dark. He thought about 42 miners pulverized in the tether shafts. "Status," Cole rasped. "We're bleeding out. The renders hit us with 300 cruisers." Admiral West's perfectly groomed eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. 300, Commander. My sensors indicate a massive debris field, but no hostile contacts. Furthermore, the debris appears to be primarily human origin. Civilian classification. The civilians held the line. Admiral, Cole said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. "They built a wall out of garbage scows and mining rigs, and they let the renders beat them to death so we could keep breathing. And Captain Bishop of the Goliath took the rest of them to hell." West frowned. He didn't like the tone. "The UNS Goliath was scuttled 50 years ago, Commander. Please keep your report factual. I am deploying engineering teams to secure your outpost and triage your remaining personnel. Power down your systems and prepare to be boarded." "Negative," Cole snapped. "We have men and women suffocating in the debris field. I don't need triage. I need tugboats. Have your destroyers break formation, extend their deflector shields over the wreckage, and start winching those hulls in. Commander Cole. West's voice hardened the polite veneer, slipping slightly. This is a military operation. My ships are currently establishing a defensive perimeter against a potential counterattack. I will not risk multi-billion credit assets by playing tow truck in an unstable debris field. Stand down. The silence in the command center was absolute. Donovan's hand drifted instinctively down to the empty holster at his hip. Hayes just stared at the screen, her eyes wide with disbelief. Before Cole could answer, the comm system flared with a burst of heavy static. A new visual feed forced its way onto the screen, overriding the core fleet's secure channel. It was Gallagher. The captain of the Stonewall looked like a corpse. Half his face was covered in severe flash burns, and his left arm was strapped tightly against his chest in a makeshift sling. The bridge behind him was completely dark, lit only by the red glow of emergency battery lights and sparking conduit wires. Admiral West. Gallagher wheezed, spitting a glob of blood onto the deck. My name is Gallagher. I command what's left of the Stonewall. We're sitting roughly 3 clicks off your port bow. West looked startled by the intrusion. Civilian vessel, you are interfering with a restricted military frequency. Clear this channel immediately. Look out your window, Admiral, Gallagher interrupted, grinning through bloody teeth. You see that massive, jagged chunk of depleted uranium floating right next to your shiny white destroyer, the one with the hazard stripes. West's eyes darted off-screen, presumably looking at his own tactical plot. That's a Class 4 mining charge strapped to a volatile chemical fuel tank, Gallagher continued smoothly. It broke off the Shenandoah when she blew. Now my targeting computer is dead, but my manual trigger isn't, and I'm looking right at it. West's face turned pale. You are threatening a core fleet vessel. That is treason. I don't give a damn about your laws, Gallagher spat. We just fought a war while you were polishing your boots. Now my people are freezing in the dark. You are going to break your perfect little formation. You are going to extend your shields, and you are going to tow my people into your warm, clean medical bays. Or I swear to God, I will detonate that charge and crack your pristine destroyer in half. Do we have an understanding? Admiral West stared at the bloodied, broken man on the screen. He looked at Cole. He was searching for a military authority to intervene a chain of command to reassert itself. But there was no chain of command here. There was only the graveyard and the people who survived it. You heard the man, Admiral, Cole said softly. Start pulling them in. West's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then with a curt, furious nod, he severed the connection. On the cracked tactical plot, the perfect mathematically flawless formation of the core fleet finally broke. The gleaming white ships moved sluggishly into the debris field, their massive tractor beams reaching out into the dark, pulling the scarred, bleeding husks of the civilian fleet out of the cold. It took 4 days to bury the dead. They didn't use coffins. There weren't enough resources left on Outpost Delta, and the core fleet refused to requisition military supplies for civilian casualties. So Miller and the surviving engineers improvised. They took the massive twisted armor plates from the Birmingham and the scorched engine cowlings of the Shenandoah, welding them together into massive hollow cylinders. They placed the bodies inside, sealed them with heavy plasma torches, and used the one functional tether to launch them into the gravitational pull of the gas giant below. Cole stood in the observation deck of the outpost, watching the metal coffins streak into the turbulent atmosphere of the massive planet. They burned brightly as they fell tiny brief shooting stars, descending into the deep, crushing storms of the giant. Hayes stood beside him. She looked older. The dark circles under her eyes hadn't faded, despite finally getting a full night's sleep. The youth had been burned out of her, replaced by a quiet, heavy resilience. "Final tally," Cole asked, not taking his eyes off the window. 8,412, Hayes read from a battered datapad. Across the civilian fleet, Delta lost 73, and the Goliath, 1,200. Donovan finished stepping up beside them. He was out of his bloody uniform, wearing a faded gray jumpsuit. The whole crew, they never had a chance to eject. The math was staggering. Almost 10,000 human lives extinguished in a matter of hours. The core fleet had spent the last 3 days conducting deep space scans, frantically searching for the render hive mind's next move. But there was no next move. The intelligence analysts aboard Admiral West's flagship were baffled. The renders were machines. They didn't feel fear. They didn't retreat unless a target was mathematically impossible to defeat. Outpost Delta was a crippled rock. The scrap fleet was entirely destroyed. The core fleet hadn't even arrived before the retreat began. By all algorithmic logic, the renders should have finished the job. "They don't understand it," Cole said quietly, leaning his forehead against the cold glass of the observation deck. "Understand what?" Donovan asked. "The renders. They're built on efficiency. They calculate mass energy output and tactical probabilities. When they look at a core fleet destroyer, they see a math problem. They know exactly how many plasma strikes it takes to drop its shields. They know exactly how fast it can turn." Cole looked at the distant glittering debris field that Admiral West's pristine ships were still carefully navigating around. But then Bishop showed up in a 50-year-old flying brick with no shields, and Cobb drove a garbage scow into a plasma volley just to spray them with shrapnel. We shot chunks of our own planet at them. Cole smiled a thin, bitter expression. "It broke their math. We showed them something they couldn't calculate. We showed them spite." Hayes looked down at her datapad, turning the screen off. "Admiral West sent over the final debriefing forms. He wants you to sign off on the official after-action report. He classified the civilian involvement as a spontaneous auxiliary support action." Donovan scoffed. "They're trying to write them out of the history books. They want the core worlds to think the 7th Fleet scared the renders away. Let them," Cole said, turning away from the window. "The politicians can write whatever they want. The brass can pin medals on their clean uniforms." He walked toward the heavy blast doors, pausing to look back at his 2 officers. "The renders know what happened here. The universe knows what happened here." Cole's voice was steady, grounded in the heavy, undeniable truth of the iron they had bled. "Humanity isn't a math problem. We're the anvil, and nothing breaks the anvil." Thank you for watching this transmission. If the relentless, unbreakable spirit of humanity got your blood pumping, hit that like button to keep the reactor running. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a drop out of slip space. Share this story with your fellow defenders of Earth and let the galaxy know humanity doesn't go quietly into the night. Drop a comment below. What would you name your dreadnought if you were making a last stand? Until next time, keep your heads down and your shields up.